The cashier's check felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands. $25,000, my entire inheritance from grandmother Elena, or so I thought. I stared at my brother Marcus across the polished marble table of the Starbucks on Fifth Avenue, watching him count the bills with the same methodical precision he'd used since we were kids playing Monopoly. Except this wasn't a game, and those weren't colorful paper bills. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "Thanks for being reasonable about this, Bella," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension wrapped in fake concern. "I know Grandma Alina meant well, leaving us equal shares, but let's be honest, you've never been good with money. Remember your college credit card disaster? This way, I can invest it properly, maybe double it in a few years through my hedge fund connections." I wanted to laugh. Marcus had always seen me as his irresponsible little sister, the one who dropped out of business school to become a social worker, who drove a 10-year-old Honda while he cruised around in his BMW. What he didn't know was that my financial struggles in college had taught me more about money than his Ivy League MBA ever could. "Of course," I replied, sliding the endorsed check across the table. "You always know best." His manicured fingers, Marcus had gotten monthly manicures since he was 16, snatched up the check with barely concealed eagerness. I noticed how his eyes lingered on those 5 beautiful zeros, probably already calculating what $25,000 could buy him. Maybe a down payment on that boat he'd been eyeing, or a weekend in the Hamptons with his latest girlfriend. The irony was almost too delicious to contain. Marcus had orchestrated this meeting 3 weeks after grandmother Elena's funeral, claiming we needed to settle the estate privately before involving lawyers. He'd presented me with what looked like official documentation showing our grandmother had left us each an equal inheritance of $25,000. Simple, clean, fair. Except Marcus had suggested that since I was still figuring out my life, it might be better if he managed both shares, promising to give me my portion once I was more financially stable. I'd played along beautifully, complete with tears about needing the money immediately for student loan payments and car repairs. Marcus had eventually agreed to lend me my own inheritance, minus a small management fee, of course. By small, he meant 40%. "I really appreciate you looking out for me," I said, watching him fold the check and slip it into his Italian leather wallet. "I don't know what I'd do without my big brother." The smile that crossed his face was pure satisfaction. Marcus had always thrived on being the successful one, the responsible one, the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Our father owned a chain of auto repair shops across Connecticut, successful enough to afford Marcus's expensive education and lifestyle, but not wealthy enough to make Marcus genuinely rich. That had always bothered him. Growing up, Marcus had been the one with straight A's and perfect attendance, while I was the one getting called to the principal's office for defending kids being bullied. He'd been valedictorian. I'd barely graduated because I spent my senior year working 2 jobs to help Mom pay for Dad's medical bills when his diabetes got bad. Marcus had sailed through Harvard Business School on Dad's savings and a partial scholarship. I'd started at a state school, dropped out when the money ran out, and worked my way through social work certification programs 1 class at a time. Different paths, different values, different definitions of success. "You know, Bella," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with that familiar air of superiority, "maybe this is exactly what you need, a wake-up call. Grandma Elena always said you had potential, but potential doesn't pay bills. Maybe now you'll finally get serious about your career, find something more substantial than working with troubled kids in the Bronx." There it was, the subtle dig at my chosen profession, delivered with just enough concern to mask the insult. Marcus had never understood why I'd chosen to work with at-risk youth when I could have followed him into business. He saw my job as glorified babysitting, something I'd eventually outgrow when I got tired of being poor. What Marcus didn't understand was that my work had connected me to people from every walk of life, including some very interesting lawyers, financial advisors, and yes, even a few judges who volunteered their time at the community center. People who believed in what I was doing and were more than willing to help when I needed advice about certain legal and financial matters. You're probably right, I agreed, standing up and shouldering my worn canvas messenger bag. I should definitely think about my future more seriously. Marcus stood too, and for a moment I saw genuine concern flicker across his features. Despite everything, despite his arrogance and condescension, I knew he did love me in his own twisted way. He just loved being superior to me more. Bella, wait, he said as I turned to leave. Look, I know I can come across as harsh sometimes, but I really do want what's best for you. Maybe we could grab dinner this weekend. I could introduce you to some people, help you network. There's this investment firm downtown that's always looking for bright people with social skills. I paused at the door, looking back at my brother's expectant face. Marcus genuinely believed he was helping me, saving me from my own poor judgment. In his mind, he was the hero of this story, the responsible older brother protecting his naive sister from financial ruin. That sounds nice, Marcus. I'll call you. I walked out into the crisp October afternoon, the sounds of Manhattan traffic washing over me like white noise. My phone buzzed almost immediately, a text from David Chen, grandmother Elena's actual lawyer, the one Marcus didn't know about. Phase 1 complete, the message read. I typed back quickly. He took the bait. Check deposited. Are you ready for Phase 2? The response came within seconds. Trust fund interest payment processed. Bank statements ready. This is going to be fun. I smiled, slipping my phone back into my bag as I walked toward the subway station. Marcus thought he'd just secured our entire inheritance and taught his little sister a valuable lesson about financial responsibility. What he'd actually done was steal a quarterly interest payment from a trust fund he didn't know existed. The real inheritance, the one grandmother Elena had set up 20 years ago but had never mentioned to anyone except her lawyer and her youngest granddaughter, was worth considerably more than $25,000. Try adding 2 more zeros to that number, and you'd be getting closer to the truth.
But Marcus would find that out soon enough. For now, I had 3 weeks to put the rest of my plan into motion. 3 weeks before the next quarterly statement arrived in the mail, addressed to me, showing a balance that would make Marcus's hedge fund connections look like penny-ante poker players. As the subway train pulled into the station, I thought about grandmother Elena's last words to me, whispering in the hospital room while Marcus was downstairs arguing with the parking attendant about validation. Isabella, mi nieta, some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Your brother has been protected from consequences his whole life. Perhaps it's time he learned what real accountability looks like. The train doors opened and I stepped inside, already anticipating Marcus's phone call in a few weeks when he realized that stealing from family had consequences he'd never imagined. 3 days after our coffee meeting, I sat in David Chen's law office in downtown Hartford, reviewing documents that told a story Marcus would never believe. The office smelled of old leather and legal briefs, its walls lined with certificates and commendations that spoke to David's 30-year career in estate law. He'd been grandmother Elena's attorney since before I was born, handling everything from her first business investments to the complex trust structures she'd built over decades of careful financial planning. Your grandmother was remarkably prescient, David said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he spread the paperwork across his mahogany desk. She established this trust in 2003, right after your parents' financial troubles began. She was concerned about your brother's spending habits even then. He was only 14, but she could see the patterns forming. I remembered that year clearly. Dad's first heart attack had left him unable to work for months, and Mom had taken on extra shifts at the nursing home where she worked as an administrator. Marcus had thrown a tantrum when they told him they might have to cancel his expensive summer camp, threatening to run away if he couldn't go. I'd spent that summer babysitting neighbors' kids to earn money for school supplies. Grandmother Elena never said anything about a trust fund, I said, running my fingers over the official seal on the documents. I mean, we knew she had some savings, but this? The numbers on the page were staggering. The initial trust deposit in 2003 was $50,000, money Elena had saved from selling her late husband's vintage car collection. Over 22 years, through careful investments guided by David's financial planning network, that $50,000 had grown into something extraordinary. Your grandmother was a child of the Depression, David explained, leaning back in his chair. She understood that money wasn't just about having it was about using it wisely, making it work for future generations. She watched your parents struggle with debt, watched your brother develop expensive tastes they couldn't really afford, and she made a decision. The trust documents were thick, filled with legal language that would have given most people a headache, but I'd learned to read contracts during my years working with families navigating social services bureaucracy. The structure was elegant in its simplicity. Elena had created an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary, but with very specific conditions. First, I couldn't access the principal until I turned 30, still 3 years away. Second, the trust would generate quarterly interest payments starting on my 25th birthday, which had been 6 months ago. Third, and most importantly, the trust's existence would remain confidential until I reached full maturity or until circumstances required its disclosure for my protection. She was protecting you, David continued, pulling out another folder. Your grandmother watched your brother manipulate your parents for years, saw how he used guilt and pressure to get what he wanted. She worried that if the family knew about your inheritance, they'd find ways to pressure you into sharing it before you were ready. The quarterly statements showed a pattern that made my recent encounter with Marcus even more satisfying. Every 3 months, like clockwork, the trust generated interest payments that were automatically deposited into a separate account Elena had established. The amounts varied based on market performance, but they typically ranged between $20,000 and $30,000. Marcus had stolen one quarterly payment and convinced himself he'd claimed our entire inheritance. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, David said with a slight smile. When your brother approached you about the estate, you could have simply told him about the trust. Instead, you chose to let him reveal his character. Your grandmother would have approved. I thought about Elena's personality, her quiet wisdom, and her belief that people should earn respect rather than inherit it. She immigrated from Mexico as a teenager, worked as a seamstress while learning English, eventually saved enough to open her own alteration shop. By the time she retired, she owned 3 shops and a small apartment building. She'd built her wealth through decades of careful decisions and delayed gratification. There's something else, David said, opening the thickest folder yet. Your grandmother left detailed instructions about what would happen if someone attempted to defraud you of your inheritance. She was very specific about the consequences. The additional documents outlined a plan that was both elegant and ruthless. If anyone attempted to manipulate me out of my inheritance through deception or coercion, the trust included provisions for immediate legal action. Elena had prepaid for investigative services, legal representation, and even media consultation if the situation warranted public attention. But the most interesting provision was something Elena called the education clause. If a family member attempted to steal from the trust, they would be required to undergo financial counseling and work in a community service capacity for 1 year. It was Elena's way of ensuring that consequences came with opportunities for genuine growth. She really thought of everything, I said, shaking my head in amazement. Your grandmother spent 3 years planning this trust structure, David replied. She consulted with financial advisors, tax attorneys, even psychologists who specialized in family dynamics. She wanted to make sure that when the time came, you'd have every tool you needed to handle whatever challenges arose. The final folder contained something that made my breath catch. Copies of bank statements and financial records showing Marcus's spending patterns over the past 5 years. Elena had been quietly monitoring her family's finances, not out of nosiness, but out of concern. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The records painted a picture of financial recklessness that was worse than I'd imagined. Marcus's credit card debt had ballooned to over $40,000, spread across 8 different cards.
He'd borrowed against his 401k twice, taken out a personal loan using his car as collateral, and had missed payments on everything from his student loans to his gym membership. How did she get all this information? I asked. Your grandmother had friends in many places, David said diplomatically. Let's just say that when you've lived in the same community for 60 years and helped dozens of families with their alterations and tailoring needs, people are willing to do favors. Bank managers, insurance agents, credit counselors, they all knew Alina Martinez as an honest businesswoman who cared about her community. The picture became clearer as I reviewed more documents. Marcus's financial problems weren't just about expensive tastes or poor budgeting. He had a gambling problem that our parents didn't know about. Online poker, sports betting, weekend trips to casinos that he'd claimed were business conferences. The quarterly interest payments from my trust fund were probably already earmarked for his debts before he'd even deposited the check. What's our next move? I asked. David pulled out a calendar and marked several dates. The next quarterly statement gets mailed in 18 days. It will show the trust balance, the recent interest payment, and the next scheduled distribution. Your brother will receive a copy as well. Elena included a provision that all family members would be notified once the trust became active. The statement would show that the $25,000 Marcus had convinced himself was our entire inheritance was actually just 3 months' worth of interest from a fund that was now worth over $2 million. But here's where it gets interesting, David continued. Your grandmother also included a provision for family mediation. Before any legal action is taken, you have the option to confront the situation directly, with professional mediation support if you choose. She believed in giving people opportunities to make things right before facing consequences. I thought about Marcus sitting in his apartment, probably already planning how to spend money that was never his to take. In his mind, he'd successfully managed a difficult family situation and secured our inheritance for responsible investment. He had no idea that he'd just committed felony theft from a trust fund, or that every transaction was being monitored by financial professionals who took fiduciary responsibility very seriously. The beautiful irony was that if Marcus had simply been honest, if he'd approached me as an equal partner rather than trying to manipulate me, I would have gladly shared the trust fund benefits with him. Alina's letter, which David had kept sealed until now, made it clear that she'd hoped the trust would eventually benefit both her grandchildren, but only after they'd both learned the value of integrity and hard work. There's one more thing, David said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in Elena's familiar handwriting. She wanted you to read this after you understood the full scope of what she'd planned. I opened the envelope carefully, unfolding pages covered in Elena's neat script. The letter was dated just 3 months before her death, when she was already too weak to come to the office, but still sharp enough to add final instructions to her trust documents. The letter began with memories of my childhood, of the afternoons I'd spent in her sewing room while she worked, asking questions about everything from fabric choices to business management. Alina had apparently seen something in those conversations that I'd missed: a curiosity about how things worked, a concern for fairness, an instinct to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But the letter's conclusion was what took my breath away. Isabella, my dear granddaughter, this trust was never really about money. It was about teaching your family that love cannot be purchased, respect cannot be inherited, and character cannot be faked. Your brother will have an opportunity to learn these lessons, but only if you're strong enough to let him face the consequences of his choices. Be strong, Mineta. Be wise. And remember that the greatest inheritance I can give you is the knowledge that you are capable of building something meaningful with whatever tools life provides. I folded the letter carefully, understanding now that the next few weeks weren't just about exposing Marcus's theft. They were about honoring Elena's memory by handling the situation with the same wisdom and strategic thinking she demonstrated throughout her life. The trap was set. Marcus had taken the bait. Now all I had to do was wait for him to realize that stealing from family had consequences he'd never imagined. 2 weeks had passed since Marcus walked away with what he believed was our entire inheritance, and I was beginning to see the ripple effects of his deception spreading through our family like cracks in ice. Mom called me 3 times that week, each conversation more strained than the last, dropping hints about Marcus's sudden generosity and asking probing questions about my financial situation. Marcus mentioned you two worked something out with Grandma Elena's estate, she said during our Thursday evening call, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when fishing for information. He said you were very mature about the whole thing, very understanding about letting him handle the investments. I was sitting in my small apartment in the Bronx, grading essays from my GED students at the community center. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Marcus was probably at some expensive restaurant celebrating his windfall, I was helping teenagers write about their dreams for the future, most of them working 2 jobs just to pay for their textbooks. Marcus has always been good with money, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I trust his judgment. What I didn't tell Mom was that I'd been tracking Marcus's spending through the network of connections I'd built over years of social work. When you help families navigate financial crises, you get to know bank managers, credit counselors, and financial advisors who remember favors. Marcus's sudden influx of cash had triggered several interesting conversations. He'd paid off his most pressing credit card debt, about $8,000, but instead of being financially responsible with the remaining $17,000, he'd made a down payment on a new Mercedes and booked a vacation to Miami Beach. The same Marcus who'd lectured me about fiscal responsibility was burning through stolen money faster than he'd ever spent his own.
But the most interesting development came from an unexpected source. Our cousin Sophia, who worked as a teller at the bank where Marcus had deposited the cashier's check. Sophia and I had been close growing up, bonding over being the different cousins in a family that valued conformity. She'd called me Tuesday night, her voice tight with concern. "Bella, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but something's not right about Marcus's story," she'd said. "He came in acting all secretive about this big inheritance, but when I processed the check, the amount didn't match what he was telling everyone. Plus, there was something weird about the way he endorsed it, like he was nervous about something." Sophia had been careful not to violate banking privacy rules, but she'd shared enough to confirm what I already knew. Marcus was lying to everyone about the inheritance amount, and his behavior at the bank had been suspicious enough to make experienced financial professionals take notice. The real breakthrough came from David Chen, who called me Friday morning with news that made my pulse quicken. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Marcus hired a private investigator." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "He what?" One of my contacts at a Hartford investigation firm got a very interesting request this week. Someone wants them to look into your grandmother's assets, specifically to verify whether there might be additional money that wasn't included in the estate settlement. The client was very specific about wanting to know if Elena Martinez had any hidden accounts or investments. This was a development I hadn't anticipated. Marcus wasn't satisfied with the $25,000 he'd stolen. He suspected there was more money somewhere, and he was actively looking for it. The irony was almost too perfect. By trying to cheat me out of additional inheritance, he was about to stumble onto the truth about the trust fund earlier than I'd planned. "Did they take the case?" I asked. "That's the interesting part," David replied. "The investigator Marcus contacted happens to be someone your grandmother used for background checks when she was hiring employees for her shops. He recognized the Martinez name and called me before taking the case. Apparently, Elena helped his daughter get a job at one of her shops 15 years ago when the girl was struggling with addiction. He feels he owes her a debt of gratitude." The investigator, Thomas Rodriguez, had agreed to take Marcus's case, but with some creative modifications to his usual approach. Instead of actually investigating Elena's finances, he would be feeding Marcus carefully curated information designed to make him even more anxious about missing out on hidden assets. Thomas is going to tell Marcus that preliminary research suggests Elena may have had additional investments, but they're tied up in complex legal structures that would require family cooperation to access, David explained. He'll suggest that Marcus needs to get you involved in the investigation, ostensibly to sign documents or provide information.
It was perfect. Marcus's greed would force him to approach me about the supposed hidden assets, giving me the opportunity to control the narrative when the trust fund revelation finally occurred. But I wanted to understand Marcus's mindset better, to see how deep his deception ran, and whether there was any possibility he might come clean on his own. So I decided to test him. Saturday afternoon, I called Marcus and suggested we have lunch. To my surprise, he seemed eager to meet, probably because he was already planning to pump me for information about Elena's potential hidden assets. We met at a trendy bistro in West Hartford, the kind of place Marcus loved because it made him feel sophisticated and successful. He arrived wearing his new watch, a Tag Heuer that probably cost $3,000, and driving the Mercedes he'd bought with my trust fund interest payment. "You look good, Bella," he said as we settled into a corner booth. "More relaxed than I've seen you in months. I told you, getting that financial stress off your shoulders would help." I smiled, sipping my iced tea, while Marcus ordered an expensive wine by the glass. "You were right, Marcus. I feel like a weight has been lifted. I can finally focus on my future instead of worrying about money all the time." What followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as brotherly concern. Marcus spent 20 minutes painting himself as the hero of our family story, the responsible one who'd stepped up to manage our inheritance when I was too overwhelmed to handle it properly. He talked about his investment strategies, his connections in the financial world, and his plans to grow our money through careful portfolio management. Then he moved in for what he thought would be the kill. "Actually, Bella, there's something I wanted to discuss with you," he said, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "I've been doing some research into Grandma Elena's finances, just to make sure we didn't miss anything. You know how private she was about money. I'm starting to think there might have been additional assets that weren't included in the estate settlement." I feigned confusion, tilting my head slightly. "What kind of assets?" "Well, you spent more time with her than I did, especially in her later years. Did she ever mention having investments asides her savings account? Maybe something about trusts or special accounts? I know she was always worried about taxes and protecting money for the family." The moment hung in the air between us. This was Marcus's opportunity to come clean, to admit he'd manipulated me into giving him money that wasn't entirely his to take. Instead, he was doubling down, trying to extract more information so he could steal additional funds he suspected might exist. "I don't think so," I said slowly, as if trying to remember. "I mean, she was always careful with money, but she never mentioned anything like that to me. Why? Do you think we made a mistake somewhere?" Marcus's eyes lit up with barely contained excitement. "Maybe. I hired someone to look into it, just to be thorough, you understand. We owe it to ourselves and to Grandma Elena's memory to make sure everything was handled properly." He was good, I had to give him that. The way he framed his greed as family loyalty and thoroughness was almost admirable in its audacity. "That makes sense," I agreed. "What do we need to do?" "Well, the investigator might need to ask you some questions, maybe have you sign some documents to authorize looking into certain records. Would you be okay with that?" I nodded eagerly, playing the role of the trusting sister perfectly. Of course, I want to make sure we handle everything right. Grandma Elena would want us to be thorough. As lunch continued, Marcus revealed more about his strategy than he probably intended. He'd already contacted 2 other law firms besides David's, fishing for information about Elena's estate. He'd visited her bank, claiming to be settling final account details. He'd even driven by her old shops, talking to current employees about whether she'd ever mentioned having investments or special accounts. The picture that emerged was of someone consumed by the possibility that he'd missed out on additional money. Someone who couldn't enjoy what he'd already stolen because he was obsessed with the idea that there was more to be taken. But what really struck me was how completely Marcus had convinced himself that he was the wronged party in this situation. In his mind, he'd been cheated out of his fair share of our inheritance, and every action he was taking was justified as correcting an injustice rather than perpetrating one. As we prepared to leave, Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me pictures from his Miami vacation. Beaches, expensive restaurants, nightclub VIP sections. Money that should have been earning interest in my account had been converted into Instagram-worthy experiences that would be forgotten in a month. "I'm thinking of making this an annual thing," he said, scrolling through photos of himself on a yacht. Life's too short not to enjoy the fruits of our success, you know. Grandma Elena worked hard her whole life. She'd want us to enjoy what she left us. I nodded and smiled, but inside I was thinking about Elena's letter, about her belief that character couldn't be faked and love couldn't be purchased. Marcus was about to learn those lessons the hard way, and despite everything he'd done, I felt a pang of sadness for the reckoning that was coming. The quarterly statement would arrive in 4 days. Thomas Rodriguez, the investigator, was scheduled to call Marcus with his preliminary findings in 72 hours. The trap was tightening, and Marcus had no idea he was walking deeper into it with every lie he told and every dollar he spent. The only question now was whether he'd learn anything from what was about to happen, or whether he'd simply find new ways to justify his behavior when his world came crashing down around him. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October, and I woke up knowing this would be the day everything changed. The quarterly trust statements had been mailed Friday afternoon, which meant Marcus would receive his copy today or tomorrow. Thomas Rodriguez, the private investigator, was scheduled to call him at 10 a.m. with his fabricated report about Elena's hidden assets. I was teaching a conflict resolution workshop at the community center when my phone started buzzing incessantly around 10:15. 7 missed calls from Marcus in the span of 10 minutes. I excused myself from the session and stepped into the hallway to call him back. "Bella, where are you?" His voice was tight, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "We need to talk, now." "I'm at work, Marcus. What's wrong?" "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped, then caught himself and forced his tone to soften. "Sorry, I'm just confused about something. Can you meet me? It's about inheritance. The investigator called with some information that doesn't make sense." I could hear papers rustling in the background and what sounded like Marcus pacing around his apartment. The quarterly statement had arrived. "What kind of information?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of concern into my voice. "Not over the phone. Can you come to my place? Please, Bella. I think someone might have made a mistake with Grandma Elena's estate, and we need to figure this out together." An hour later, I stood outside Marcus's downtown Hartford apartment building, a converted warehouse that had been transformed into luxury lofts. Marcus buzzed me up immediately, and I found him waiting in his doorway, still wearing the expensive clothes that had become his uniform since stealing my money, but looking haggard in a way that designer labels couldn't hide. His apartment was a study in contrasts: expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but scattered papers and empty coffee cups suggesting someone who hadn't slept much the night before. On his glass dining table, I could see documents spread out like evidence at a crime scene. "Okay," Marcus said without preamble, "I need you to explain something to me." He picked up an official-looking envelope and pulled out the quarterly statement, his hands shaking slightly. The letterhead read Hartford Trust Management, and the document was addressed to both Marcus A. Caldwell and Isabella M. Caldwell as interested parties in the Elena Martinez Irrevocable Trust. "This came in today's mail," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "According to this, our grandmother had a trust fund worth over $2 million, and you're listed as the sole beneficiary. It says here that quarterly interest payments of $25,000 are automatically deposited into an account in your name." I took the statement from his trembling hands, pretending to read it for the first time. The numbers were exactly what David Chen had told me to expect. Principal balance of $2,247,000, quarterly interest payment of $25,000, next distribution date 3 months away. "This can't be right," I said, frowning at the document. "Grandma Elena never mentioned anything like this to me. Are you sure this isn't some kind of scam?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's what I thought at first, but then the investigator called this morning with information that matches exactly what's in this statement. Isabella, the $25,000 you gave me, that wasn't our inheritance. That was just 3 months' worth of interest from a trust fund I didn't know existed." The moment stretched between us, and I watched Marcus's face as the implications began to sink in. He'd stolen money from a trust fund. He'd manipulated his sister into giving him what he thought was their shared inheritance, when in reality, he'd taken interest payments from an account that was legally mine alone. "But I don't understand," I said, maintaining my confused act. If this is real, why didn't anyone tell us about it before? Why wasn't it mentioned when the lawyer read Grandma Elena's will? Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was caught in lies by our parents. Because apparently it's a separate legal entity. The investigator explained it to me. Trusts like this operate independently from regular estate settlements. The lawyer who handled Grandma Elena's will might not have even known about it. That was partially true, which made Marcus's explanation more believable. David Chen had handled both Elena's regular estate and the trust, but many families do use different attorneys for different financial instruments. Okay, so let's say this is real, I said, sitting down on his leather couch. Marcus sat down across from me, the coffee table and its scattered papers creating a barrier between us. It means I made a terrible mistake, Bella. When I found what I thought was documentation about our inheritance, when I suggested that I should manage both shares, I was wrong. I took money that wasn't mine to take.
For a brief moment, I thought Marcus might actually confess, might take responsibility for what he'd done and apologize. Instead, he pivoted in a direction that was both predictable and infuriating. But here's the thing, he continued, leaning forward with renewed energy. This trust fund, it's clearly something Grandma Elena set up for both of us. I mean, look at the timing. She established it right after Dad's heart problems, when our whole family was struggling financially. She wouldn't have cut me out completely. I stared at him, amazed by his ability to rationalize. Even faced with legal documents clearly stating that I was the sole beneficiary, Marcus was convincing himself that the trust was somehow meant to be shared. The investigator thinks there might have been an error in the trust documentation, Marcus continued, his voice gaining confidence as he built his new narrative. Maybe Grandma Elena intended for both of us to be beneficiaries, but the paperwork was filed incorrectly. Or maybe there was a more recent version of the trust that included me, but it got lost in the bureaucracy. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but I also felt a deep sadness watching my brother create elaborate justifications rather than face the simple truth that he'd stolen from me. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "I think we need to contest the trust," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "I've already researched attorneys who specialize in trust disputes. If we can prove that Grandma Elena intended for both of us to benefit from this fund, we could have the documentation corrected. It would be the fair thing, the right thing." There it was. Marcus's solution to discovering he'd committed theft wasn't to return the money or apologize. It was to sue for access to more money that legally belonged to me. "Marcus," I said slowly, "what about the $25,000 you already took? If this trust fund is real, and if those were my quarterly interest payments, then I'll pay it back," he interrupted quickly. "Of course I'll pay it back, with interest. But Bella, we're talking about $2 million here. Even if the trust was set up incorrectly, even if I'm not technically a beneficiary, surely you'd want to share it with your brother. Family takes care of family, right?" The conversation that followed was like watching someone drowning while refusing to grab the life preserver being thrown to them. For 45 minutes, Marcus cycled through every manipulation technique in his arsenal. He appealed to family loyalty, suggested that Elena must have been confused in her old age, and argued that $2 million was too much money for one person to handle responsibly. He reminded me of all the times he'd helped me growing up, conveniently forgetting that most of those favors had come with strings attached or had been ways to make himself look good to our parents. He talked about how hurt our parents would be if they knew I was keeping such a large inheritance from my brother. He even suggested that Elena would have wanted us to share the money, despite legal documents stating otherwise. But the most revealing part of the conversation came when Marcus started talking about his plans for our trust fund money. "Think about what we could do with $2 million, Bella," he said, his eyes lighting up with possibilities. "I could quit my job, maybe start that consulting business I've been thinking about. You could go back to school, get your master's degree, maybe even a PhD. We could buy investment properties, build something lasting for our future families." It was a beautiful vision, except for one crucial detail.
None of Marcus's plans involved paying back the money he'd already stolen, and all of them assumed he was entitled to half of a trust fund that legally belonged entirely to me. I need time to think about this, I finally said, gathering up my purse and jacket. Marcus jumped up immediately. Of course, this is a lot to process. But Bella, we should probably move quickly on getting legal representation. Trust disputes can be time-sensitive, and we don't want to miss any deadlines. As I headed toward the door, Marcus caught my arm gently. I know this is overwhelming, and for a moment his voice carried genuine emotion. But we're family, Bella. We've always figured things out together. This is just another challenge we need to face as a team. I looked into my brother's eyes and saw something that broke my heart. He genuinely believed his own justifications. Marcus had convinced himself so thoroughly that he deserved access to my trust fund that he couldn't see how his behavior looked from the outside. In his mind, he was the victim of bureaucratic errors and family miscommunication, not a thief who'd manipulated his sister out of $25,000. I'll call you tomorrow, I promised, and left him standing in his doorway, surrounded by luxury he'd purchased with stolen money, planning lawsuits to steal more. The elevator ride down felt like a descent from a fantasy world back to reality. Marcus was living in a bubble of self-deception so complete that he couldn't see the legal and moral catastrophe he was creating for himself. The quarterly statement should have been a wake-up call, a moment for him to realize his mistake and try to make things right. Instead, it had become fuel for his next scheme. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. How did he take the news? I typed back, he wants to sue me for half the trust fund. We're moving to phase 3. The response came immediately. Elena predicted this reaction. Are you ready for what comes next? I thought about Elena's letter, about her belief that some lessons could only be learned through consequences. Marcus had been given multiple opportunities to do the right thing, and he chose deception and greed every time. I'm ready, I texted back, and drove home to prepare for the final act of a drama that Marcus had written himself, one stolen dollar at a time. The emergency family meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at our parents' house in Waterbury, the same colonial where Marcus and I had grown up arguing over board games and fighting for the last piece of Mom's apple pie. But as I sat in the living room that had witnessed countless family discussions over the years, I knew this conversation would be unlike any we'd ever had. Mom had arranged the meeting after Marcus called her Wednesday night, claiming there was a serious legal situation involving Elena's estate that required immediate family intervention. He'd painted himself as the responsible son trying to protect family interests, while carefully omitting the part about stealing $25,000 from me. Dad sat in his recliner, looking older than his 68 years, still recovering from his latest round of diabetes complications. Mom perched on the edge of the sofa, her nervous energy evident in the way she kept adjusting the throw pillows. Marcus arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, playing the role of the concerned businessman dealing with a family crisis. Before we start, Marcus announced, pulling out copies of the trust fund documents, I want everyone to understand that this isn't about money. It's about fairness and honoring Grandma Elena's true intentions. The irony of Marcus lecturing anyone about fairness while wearing a watch purchased with stolen money was almost too much to bear. I don't understand what's happening, Mom said, accepting the papers Marcus handed her. Elena never mentioned any trust fund to us. Are you sure these documents are legitimate? Marcus launched into his carefully prepared presentation, explaining how his investigation had uncovered the trust fund, how the legal documentation appeared to exclude him unfairly, and how he believed Elena had intended for both of her grandchildren to benefit from her careful financial planning. What he didn't mention was how he discovered the trust fund in the first place, or that he'd already spent the money he'd taken from my quarterly interest payment. The way I see it, Marcus continued, this is clearly an oversight that needs to be corrected. Elena loved both of us equally. She would never have intentionally cut me out of her estate planning.
The trust documents might have been filed incorrectly, or there might have been a more recent version that included me as a beneficiary. Dad studied the papers with the careful attention he'd once given to automotive repair manuals. These look official, Marcus. If Elena set up this trust with Isabella as the sole beneficiary, there must have been a reason. But that's just it, Dad, Marcus said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he'd perfected in business school. Elena was in her 80s when these documents were finalized. She was dealing with medications, stress from her health problems, pressure from lawyers who might not have understood her real wishes. It's entirely possible that she was confused about the legal implications of what she was signing. I watched our parents' faces as Marcus built his case, saw how his arguments landed with people who wanted to believe the best about their son. Mom especially seemed swayed by Marcus's suggestion that Elena might have been manipulated by lawyers or confused by complex legal documents. "What do you think, Isabella?" Dad asked, turning to me with the same measured expression he'd worn during my teenage years when I'd gotten into trouble. "You spent more time with Elena in her final years. Did she ever mention wanting to provide for both of you?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the chance to reveal the truth about Marcus's theft while maintaining the moral high ground. But looking at my parents, Dad with his fragile health, Mom with her desperate desire for family harmony, I realized that the full truth might destroy more than just Marcus. "Grandma Elena was very sharp until the end," I said carefully. "She knew exactly what she was doing with her finances. If she set up the trust with me as the sole beneficiary, she had her reasons." Marcus's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. He'd expected me to go along with his narrative about Elena being confused or manipulated. "But Isabella," Mom interjected, "surely you can see how hurtful this must be for Marcus. Elena raised you both, loved you both. It doesn't seem like her to show such favoritism." The conversation that followed revealed family dynamics I'd been too young to fully understand growing up. Mom talked about how guilty she'd always felt about not being able to provide equally for both her children, how Marcus's academic success had required financial sacrifices that left less money available for my education. Dad mentioned how hard it had been to watch Marcus struggle with debt despite his expensive degree, while I seemed to find fulfillment in work that paid very little. "Maybe Elena saw that Marcus had already gotten advantages in life," I suggested gently. "The private tutoring, the prep school, the Harvard education, all of that cost money. Maybe she wanted to balance things out by providing for my future." Marcus leaned forward aggressively. "That's not fair, Isabella. Those weren't advantages. They were investments in my potential. Mom and Dad made those sacrifices because they believed in my abilities, and everything I've achieved since then has been through my own hard work." The selective memory was breathtaking. Marcus had conveniently forgotten about the unpaid internship Dad had arranged through his business connections, the down payment loan our parents had given him for his first apartment, the credit card bills they'd quietly paid when his spending got out of control during business school. "What exactly are you proposing?" Dad asked, cutting through the tension. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder of legal documents. "I've consulted with 3 different attorneys who specialize in trust disputes. They all agree that we have grounds to challenge the trust documentation. If we can prove that Elena intended for both beneficiaries to benefit, or if we can demonstrate that she was improperly advised when setting up the trust, we can have it modified." The legal papers Marcus spread across the coffee table were impressive. Letterheads from prestigious law firms, preliminary assessments suggesting various strategies for contesting the trust. What our parents couldn't see was that Marcus had paid for these consultations with stolen money, and that he'd lied to the attorneys about how he'd discovered the trust fund's existence. "The best part," Marcus continued, "is that Isabella wouldn't lose anything. Instead of being the sole beneficiary of a trust that creates tax complications and family tension, she'd be a 50% beneficiary of a fund that could bring our family closer together." Mom's eyes lit up at the mention of family unity. She'd spent 30 years trying to navigate the different personalities and needs of her children, always hoping we'd eventually develop the close relationship she'd dreamed of when we were young. "It does seem like a fair thing," she said cautiously. "Elena would want her grandchildren to support each other, not fight over money." Dad was more skeptical.
What are the costs of this legal challenge, and what happens if you lose? Marcus had prepared for this question. The attorneys are confident enough in our case that they're willing to work on a contingency basis. If we win, they take a percentage of the settlement. If we lose, we don't owe them anything. What Marcus didn't mention was that even a successful challenge would likely cost tens of thousands in legal fees, and that trust disputes could drag on for years, consuming resources and destroying family relationships in the process. I think we need to hear what Isabella wants to do, Dad said, looking at me with the same expression he'd worn when teaching me to drive, patient, but expecting me to make the right decision. The weight of their expectations settled on my shoulders like a familiar burden. Throughout my childhood, I'd been the one expected to accommodate Marcus's needs, to understand his ambitions, to make allowances for his difficult personality. Now, even faced with legal documents proving my sole claim to Elena's trust fund, I was being asked to consider sharing it for the sake of family harmony. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. This is a lot to process, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications before making any decisions. Marcus's face fell. He'd clearly expected me to agree immediately, swept up by family pressure and his persuasive arguments. Of course, Mom said quickly. This is a big decision. But Isabella, I hope you'll consider what Elena would really want. She loved both of you so much. As the meeting began to wind down, Marcus made one final push. There's something else we should consider, he said, his voice taking on a tone of reluctant revelation. The attorneys mentioned that trust disputes can sometimes trigger IRS audits of the entire estate. If there were any irregularities in how Elena set up the trust, Isabella could end up facing tax penalties or legal complications that would cost more than just sharing the fund with me. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, threatening me with legal consequences for keeping money that was rightfully mine, while positioning himself as the protective brother trying to shield me from potential problems. Dad's expression darkened. Marcus, are you suggesting that your sister should give you half of her inheritance because you're threatening to create legal problems for her? No, of course not, Marcus backtracked quickly. I'm just saying that challenging the trust might actually protect Isabella from future complications. Sometimes these estate planning documents contain errors that don't surface until years later. But Dad had caught the underlying threat, and his look of disappointment was devastating. For the first time, I saw our father recognize something ugly in his golden child, something that no amount of academic achievement or professional success could disguise. The meeting ended with tense hugs and promises to continue the conversation soon. As I gathered my things to leave, Mom pulled me aside. Isabella, honey, I know this is difficult, she whispered, but Marcus has always struggled with feeling like he has to prove himself. Maybe sharing the trust fund would help him feel more secure, more able to make good decisions. The sad irony was that Mom genuinely believed giving Marcus access to more unearned money would somehow cure the character flaws that had led him to steal from me in the first place. I'll think about it, Mom, I promised, and meant it. Not because I was considering giving Marcus half of my trust fund, but because I was trying to figure out how to reveal his theft in a way that might actually teach him something, rather than just destroying him. As I drove home through the Connecticut countryside, past the familiar landmarks of my childhood, I realized that the family I'd grown up in was built on a foundation of denial and enabling that went much deeper than Marcus's recent theft. The trust fund hadn't created our family's problems, it had simply revealed them. The question now was whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage, or whether some relationships were too damaged by years of lies and manipulation to ever be repaired. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the family meeting. I was getting ready for work when my phone erupted with the aggressive ringtone I'd assigned to Marcus's number. His voice was barely controlled panic wrapped in false bravado. Isabella, we have a serious problem. The bank is asking questions about that cashier's check, and there are some complications with the trust fund that we need to address immediately. I sat down on my bed, coffee mug in hand, and prepared for what I knew would be Marcus's most desperate performance yet. What kind of complications? The trust management company is claiming that the quarterly payment I received was obtained through fraud. They're saying someone forged your signature on authorization documents. Isabella, they're threatening to involve law enforcement if this isn't resolved within 48 hours. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had spent weeks trying to convince our family that I should voluntarily share my trust fund with him. Now he was discovering that stealing from a federally regulated trust fund carried consequences he'd never imagined. David Chen had orchestrated this perfectly. Instead of immediately pressing criminal charges, he'd allowed Marcus to dig himself deeper into legal trouble while documenting every lie, every attempt to manipulate the family, every dollar spent from stolen funds. "Marcus, I'm confused," I said, maintaining my innocent act. "Why would the trust company think you forged my signature? What authorization documents are they talking about?" The silence stretched for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard since we were children.
Isabella, I need to tell you something. When I found the documentation about our inheritance, when I suggested that I should manage both our shares, there were some forms that needed to be signed. You were so overwhelmed, so grateful to have me handle everything, that I may have signed your name on a few documents, just to expedite the process. Even in confession, Marcus couldn't tell the complete truth. He'd forged my signature on multiple documents, lied about the inheritance amount, and manipulated me into endorsing a check that contained stolen money. But in his version of events, he was still the protective brother who'd made a small procedural error while trying to help his overwhelmed sister. "You forged my signature?" I let the appropriate shock color my voice. "Marcus, that's illegal. That's fraud." "It's not fraud when it's money that rightfully belongs to both of us," he said, desperation creeping into his tone. "Isabella, the signature issue is just a technicality. The real problem is that the trust company is refusing to acknowledge my legitimate claim to half of Grandma Elena's fund. They're using this paperwork confusion as an excuse to deny family justice." I had to admire Marcus's ability to reframe criminal behavior as righteous indignation. Even caught red-handed committing forgery, he was positioning himself as the victim of bureaucratic injustice. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "We need to meet with the trust company together, today if possible. You need to clarify that you authorized me to act on your behalf, that the signature issue was just a misunderstanding between siblings. Once we clear that up, we can focus on the real issue, getting the trust documentation corrected to include me as a beneficiary." The request was breathtaking in its audacity. Marcus wanted me to help him cover up his forgery so he could continue pursuing a lawsuit to steal half of my trust fund. "I'll need to call in sick to work," I said. "Where are we meeting?" "The Hartford Trust Management Office downtown. I already scheduled an appointment for 11 a.m. "Isabella, thank you. I know this is complicated, but once we sort this out, everything will be better for both of us." 2 hours later, I sat in the elegant conference room of Hartford Trust Management, watching Marcus charm the receptionist while we waited for David Chen to arrive. Marcus had dressed for battle in his most expensive suit, radiating the confidence of someone who'd convinced himself that legal problems could be solved through force of personality and expensive lawyers. When David entered the room, followed by 2 other men in conservative suits, Marcus stood up with the practiced handshake of someone accustomed to high-stakes business meetings. "Mr. Chen, thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting. I'm Marcus Caldwell, and I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding regarding my family's trust fund." David shook Marcus's hand politely, then introduced his companions, James Morrison, a federal investigator specializing in financial crimes, and Robert Santos, a prosecutor from the Connecticut Attorney General's office. The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized this wasn't going to be the administrative meeting he'd expected. "Please, everyone sit down," David said calmly.
Mr. Caldwell, I think there are some things you need to understand about the situation you've created. What followed was a methodical dismantling of every lie Marcus had told over the past month. David presented bank records showing the forged signatures, surveillance footage of Marcus depositing the cashier's check, and documentation of every purchase he'd made with stolen money. The Mercedes, the vacation, the expensive watch, every transaction had been tracked and categorized as evidence of theft from a federal trust fund. The Elena Martinez Irrevocable Trust is regulated under federal banking laws, Morrison explained. Unauthorized access to trust fund assets constitutes wire fraud, forgery, and theft of funds under federal jurisdiction. These are felony charges carrying potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the full scope of his legal jeopardy became clear. He'd thought he was manipulating his naive sister out of some family money. Instead, he'd committed multiple federal crimes that were meticulously documented by professionals who specialized in exactly this type of financial fraud. However, Santos continued, the beneficiary of the trust has some discretion in how this matter proceeds. Miss Caldwell, you have the right to pursue full criminal prosecution, or you can choose alternative resolutions that might serve justice while avoiding the lengthy process of federal prosecution. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of Elena's wisdom in that moment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about consequences that might actually learn Marcus something about accountability and responsibility. What do you need me to do? I asked. David opened another folder, revealing documents that Elena had prepared with almost supernatural foresight into her family's character flaws. Your grandmother included specific provisions for situations exactly like this, he explained. If anyone attempted to defraud the trust through forgery or manipulation, they would be required to make full restitution plus damages, undergo financial counseling, and complete 1,000 hours of community service, working with organizations that help families in financial crisis. The elegance of Elena's solution was perfect. Marcus would have to repay every stolen dollar, learn about financial responsibility from professionals, and spend nearly 6 months working with people whose lives had been damaged by exactly the kind of reckless behavior he demonstrated. The alternative, Santos added, is full prosecution under federal law, which would result in felony convictions, significant prison time, and a criminal record that would end your career in financial services permanently. Marcus looked around the room like a cornered animal, finally understanding that his charm and manipulation tactics were useless against federal prosecutors armed with ironclad evidence. I need to call my attorney, he stammered. You're certainly welcome to do that, Morrison replied, but I should mention that we've already been in contact with the 3 law firms you consulted about challenging the trust. When they learned you'd obtained their services using stolen money and had lied about how you discovered the trust fund's existence, they immediately withdrew their representation and reported your behavior to the State Bar Association. The final blow came when David presented bank statements showing that Marcus had spent almost the entire $25,000 within 3 weeks of stealing it. Even if he wanted to make immediate restitution, he no longer had the money to repay what he'd taken. Marcus, I said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over the room, you have a choice to make. You can accept Grandma Elena's terms for resolving this situation, or you can face federal prosecution for multiple felonies. But either way, you're going to learn that actions have consequences. For the first time in our adult lives, I saw my brother cry. Not the manipulative tears he'd used to get out of trouble as a child, but the genuine anguish of someone finally understanding the magnitude of their mistakes. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice broken. Isabella, I'm so sorry. I convinced myself that I deserved part of the money, that Elena would want us to share it. But that wasn't really about the money, was it? It was about me feeling like I was never enough, like I always had to prove I was worth something. The confession hung in the air between us, more honest than any conversation we'd had in years. Marcus was finally seeing himself clearly, stripped of the justifications and rationalizations that had allowed him to steal from his own sister while convincing himself he was the victim. "What do you want to do?" I asked him. Marcus wiped his eyes with his expensive sleeve, looking around the conference room that had become the setting for his reckoning. "I'll accept Elena's terms," he said quietly. "All of them. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." David nodded and began pulling out the paperwork that would formalize Marcus's agreement to restitution, counseling, and community service. As my brother signed document after document, acknowledging his crimes and accepting responsibility for their consequences, I thought about Elena's letter and her belief that some lessons could only be learned through adversity. The trust fund had revealed truths about my family that might have remained hidden forever, but it had also created an opportunity for genuine growth and healing if Marcus was willing to do the hard work of changing who he was rather than simply managing the consequences of who he'd been. The reckoning was complete. Now came the harder task of rebuilding trust, respect, and relationship from the ashes of deception and theft. 6 months later, I stood in the parking lot of the Hartford Community Kitchen, watching my brother Marcus load boxes of donated food into a delivery van. His expensive suits had been replaced by jeans and volunteer t-shirts, his manicured hands now bore the calluses of manual labor, and the arrogant confidence that had once defined him had evolved into something quieter but more genuine. "Ready for the last delivery of the day?" I called out, approaching the van where Marcus was checking items against his clipboard. He looked up with a smile that still surprised me, not the practiced charm he'd wielded like a weapon for most of his adult life, but something authentic and earned through months of hard work and honest self-reflection. "Almost done," he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Mrs. Patterson's family is expecting us by 4, and I promised her granddaughter I'd help with her math homework after we unload. Turns out financial planning skills are useful for teaching factions." The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Those first weeks after the confrontation at the trust management office had been brutal for everyone. Marcus had moved back in with our parents, selling his luxury apartment and expensive car to begin making restitution payments. The shame of explaining his situation to Mom and Dad was almost harder for him to bear than the legal consequences. But Alina's wisdom had proven itself once again. The community service requirement hadn't just been punishment, it had been rehabilitation. Working with families in a financial crisis had shown Marcus what real hardship looked like, what genuine struggle meant for people who didn't have safety nets or family wealth to fall back on. "How's the financial counseling going?" I asked as we climbed into the van. Marcus started the engine, a rueful smile crossing his face. "Humbling. Dr. Rodriguez has me tracking every penny I spend, creating budgets for imaginary scenarios, and writing essays about my relationship with money. Last week's assignment was to calculate how many hours of minimum wage work it would take to pay for each item I bought with your trust fund money." The number had been staggering, over 3,000 hours of work at minimum wage to cover the cars, vacations, and luxury items Marcus had purchased with $25,000 of stolen money. For someone who'd never considered the true cost of his lifestyle, the exercise had been a devastating wake-up call. "The hardest part," Marcus continued as we drove through downtown Hartford, "is realizing how many people I could have helped instead of buying things I didn't need. That $25,000 could have funded the entire after-school program at the community center for a year. Instead, I spent it on a vacation I barely remember and a car that's now worth half what I paid for it." The route to Mrs. Patterson's house took us through neighborhoods where many of the families Marcus had been serving lived, areas where poverty wasn't a temporary setback but a generational challenge requiring systemic solutions and community support. Over the past months, Marcus had learned the names and stories of dozens of families and had seen how financial stress affected everything from children's academic performance to elderly residents' healthcare decisions. "There's something I want to talk to you about," Marcus said, as we pulled into Mrs. Patterson's driveway. "I've been thinking about what comes next, after I finish the community service requirement." Mrs. Patterson's house was a small ranch that had seen better decades, but her yard was immaculately maintained and her front porch decorated with handmade crafts that spoke to a family's determination to create beauty despite limited resources. Marcus had become genuinely fond of the Patterson family during his weekly deliveries, had watched Mrs. Patterson care for her disabled grandson while working 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet. "What do you mean, what comes next?" I asked. "I mean my career, my life purpose, what I want to do with whatever time I have left to make a difference," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a seriousness I'd never heard before. "I can't go back to the financial services industry, not with the ethics violations on my record. But honestly, I don't want to go back. The work I've been doing here, helping families navigate financial challenges, connecting them with resources, it feels more meaningful than anything I did in my old job."
Mrs. Patterson greeted us at the door with the warm smile that had made her a favorite among the community kitchen volunteers. Her 8-year-old granddaughter, Sarah, immediately attached herself to Marcus, chattering about a math test she'd aced thanks to his tutoring. "Mr. Marcus, Miss Isabella," Sarah exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. "Grandma made cookies to say thank you for bringing the groceries every week. And guess what? I got an A on my fractions test." The scene that followed was one I would remember for the rest of my life. Marcus, who had once measured success in stock options and luxury purchases, sat at a worn kitchen table helping a 3rd grader with homework while her grandmother prepared a simple meal with ingredients from our food delivery. The genuine joy on his face as Sarah solved a difficult math problem was worth more than any expensive watch or fancy car he'd ever owned. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson pulled me aside while Marcus loaded empty boxes into the van. "Your brother is special," she said quietly. "I've seen a lot of volunteers come through here over the years. Some good people, some just doing it for community service credits. But Marcus cares. I really care. He remembers details about our family, asks about Sarah's school, helps me understand financial aid paperwork. He's got a gift for making people feel heard." Driving back to the community center, I shared Mrs. Patterson's observations with Marcus, watching him process the idea that he might have value beyond his resume credentials or bank account balance. "I've been talking to Dr. Rodriguez about career possibilities," he said. "There are certification programs for financial counseling, especially for people working with low-income families. It would mean starting over, making a fraction of what I used to earn, but it would mean doing work that matters," I finished for him. "Exactly. And Isabella, there's something else. I want to establish a fund, not from your trust money, obviously, but from my restitution payments and whatever I can earn going forward. Something to help families like the Pattersons, named after Grandma Elena." The idea was ambitious and would require years of careful saving and planning, but for the first time since childhood, Marcus was talking about building something rather than taking something, about creating value rather than claiming it. That evening, we met David Chen at his office to review the final paperwork for Marcus's community service completion. The 1,000 hours had been fulfilled 3 weeks early, thanks to Marcus's tendency to show up for extra shifts and volunteer for additional projects. "The community kitchen supervisors have submitted excellent reports," David said, reviewing the documentation. "They're hoping you'll continue volunteering even after the requirement is officially complete." Marcus nodded immediately. "I'm planning to stay involved. There's still so much work to do, and I'm finally good at something that actually helps people." David pulled out one final envelope, this one bearing Elena's distinctive handwriting. "Your grandmother left instructions that this should be given to Marcus only after he'd completed the community service requirement," he explained. Marcus opened the letter with trembling hands, and I watched tears form in his eyes as he read Elena's final message to him. "She says," Marcus paused, his voice breaking, "she says she always knew I had the capacity for greatness, but that I was looking for it in all the wrong places. She says she's proud of me for choosing the harder path of growth over the easier path of justification." The letter also contained a surprise. Elena had established a small scholarship fund for Marcus to pursue financial counseling certification, contingent on his completing the community service requirement and maintaining his commitment to helping others. "She believed in redemption," David said gently. "Your grandmother understood that people could change, but only if they were willing to face the truth about themselves and do the work necessary for growth." As we left David's office, Marcus turned to me with an expression of profound gratitude and lingering shame.
Isabella, I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you, for the trust I broke and the pain I caused, but I want to spend the rest of my life trying. I thought about Elena's words, about legacy being more important than revenge, about the difference between punishment and justice. You already are making up for it, I told him. Every family you help, every hour you spend teaching kids like Sarah, every person you connect with resources they need, that's how you honor what Grandma Elena wanted for both of us. A year later, Marcus graduated from his financial counseling certification program and accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy services to underserved communities. He lived in a modest apartment, drove a practical used car, and found joy in work that paid a fraction of his former salary but provided satisfaction he'd never imagined possible. The trust fund remained intact, generating quarterly payments that I used to expand the after-school programs at my community center and establish the Elena Martinez Family Support Foundation. Marcus contributed to the foundation with his own modest earnings, and together we created something that honored our grandmother's memory while helping families avoid the financial crises that had shaped our own childhood. Our parents slowly learned to see Marcus's transformation as genuine rather than performative, though Dad never quite forgave the betrayal, and Mom struggled with grief over the successful son she thought she'd raised. But family healing, like personal growth, happened gradually and required patience from everyone involved. The final vindication came 2 years later, when Marcus was offered a position at a prestigious financial planning firm, a chance to return to his former life of expensive suits and luxury lifestyles. He turned it down without hesitation, choosing instead to open his own practice focused on financial counseling for working families. Standing in his small office on opening day, surrounded by families from the community where he'd done his service hours, I saw Marcus as he truly was. Not the golden child or the family disappointment, but a man who'd learned that real success meant building others up rather than climbing over them. Elena's trust fund had done exactly what she'd intended. It had revealed character, taught consequences, and ultimately created opportunities for growth that couldn't have been purchased with any amount of money. Her greatest gift to our family wasn't the financial security she'd provided, but the wisdom to understand that legacy isn't about what you leave behind, but about how you transform the people you love. The inheritance had been just the beginning. The real treasure was what Marcus and I had learned about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility that people could change when they were finally ready to face the truth about themselves. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.